The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor punctuated the otherwise silent hospital room as Marcus Wells lay motionless, tubes and wires connecting his frail body to an array of medical equipment. Outside the private suite's large windows, the Chicago skyline glittered against the night sky, the same skyline dominated by the Wells Tower, a gleaming testament to the business empire built by the man now fighting for his life. At 68, Marcus had conquered the business world as the founder and CEO of Wells Pharmaceuticals, amassing a fortune through revolutionary cancer treatments and controversial pricing strategies that had made him both admired and despised throughout the country. Standing by his bedside, Sophia Jackson checked his vitals with practiced efficiency. At 36, she had spent 14 years as a nurse at Chicago Memorial Hospital, the last 5 in the intensive cardiac care unit. Her crisp blue uniform contrasted with her deep brown skin as she recorded Marcus's latest readings in the digital chart. Despite the late hour, just past 2 a.m., her alertness never wavered. She had volunteered for the night shift, monitoring the hospital's most high-profile patient, though few knew her real reason for doing so. The door opened quietly, revealing Richard Wells, Marcus's son and the company's CFO. At 42, Richard was the spitting image of his father in his younger days, tall, imposing, with the same piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of profit and loss. His bespoke suit was wrinkled from the long hours he had spent at the hospital since his father's massive heart attack 3 days ago. "How is he?" Richard asked, his voice low and controlled despite the fatigue evident on his face. "No change," Sophia replied professionally, her tone revealing nothing of her personal feelings toward the Wells family. "The doctor will be making rounds at 6 a.m. to reassess." Richard nodded, moving closer to his father's bed. "They say people in comas can sometimes hear. Is that true?" "Some studies suggest it's possible," Sophia acknowledged. "Many families find comfort in speaking to their loved ones regardless." Richard hesitated, then turned to Sophia. "Could I have a moment alone with my father, please?" "Of course. I'll be right outside if you need me." Sophia stepped toward the door, her movements quiet and efficient. "Thank you, Ms." Richard glanced at her name badge. "Jackson." Sophia nodded and slipped out of the room, but rather than walking away, she found herself pausing outside the door, which had not fully closed. She knew she should move farther away to give Richard his privacy, but something kept her rooted to the spot, listening as Richard began to speak to his unconscious father. "Dad, the board's in chaos. Pearson and Thompson are already suggesting we need to announce a succession plan. The stock fell 8 points today." Richard's voice was strained. "I told them you'd be back soon, that this is temporary, but—" He broke off, and there was a long silence before he continued, his voice suddenly harder. "I found the files, Dad. The ones you kept in the hidden safe behind Mother's portrait. I know what you did in Newark. I know about the trials. How could you?" Sophia stiffened at the mention of Newark, her hand instinctively rising to touch the small locket hidden beneath her uniform. The single word sent her mind racing back 20 years to the clinical trials that had brought Sophia, then just 16, and her mother to the rundown research facility in Newark, New Jersey. Trials that had promised hope but delivered devastation. Inside the room, Richard was still speaking, his voice rising slightly. "The lawyers say it could destroy everything if it gets out. 20 years isn't long enough for something like this to stay buried. People are still alive who remember, people who could testify." Sophia forced herself to step away from the door, her heart pounding. She shouldn't be listening to this conversation, shouldn't be hearing confirmation of what she had spent years trying to prove. As she walked to the nurse's station, memories flooded back. Her mother's worsening condition, the dismissive doctors, the paperwork that no one would show them, and finally, the quiet funeral that Sophia had paid for with the small settlement check that came with a non-disclosure agreement she'd been too young and grief-stricken to understand. Sophia had recognized Marcus Wells the moment he was wheeled into the cardiac unit 3 days ago. She had volunteered to be his primary care nurse, not out of admiration or a sense of duty, but because she had waited 20 years to look into the eyes of the man whose company had used her mother as a human test subject, documenting the acceptable losses in the pursuit of a breakthrough drug that would later make Wells Pharmaceuticals billions. When Richard emerged from his father's room 30 minutes later, Sophia had regained her professional composure. "Will you be staying the night, Mr. Wells?" she asked. "No, I need to handle some things at the office, but I'll be back in the morning." Richard hesitated. "Miss Jackson, my father is a complicated man, but he's built something important. Wells Pharmaceuticals saves lives. Whatever happens, I hope you'll remember that." "I never forget the impact one person can have, Mr. Wells," Sophia replied evenly, "for better or worse." As Richard departed, Sophia returned to Marcus's room, checking the monitors and adjusting his IV. Alone with the man who had changed the course of her life, she studied his face, slack in unconsciousness, but still bearing the marks of arrogance and determination that she had seen in countless magazine covers and television interviews. "I recognize you, you know," she said softly to the unconscious man. "Not just as Marcus Wells, the billionaire CEO. I recognize you as the man who signed off on compound WP-137 despite the preliminary data showing liver toxicity, the man who decided my mother's life was an acceptable cost of doing business." The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, giving no indication that Marcus could hear her. Sophia touched the locket beneath her uniform, which contained a small photo of her mother. "She believed you were going to help her," Sophia continued, her voice barely audible. "She trusted the doctors who told her this was her best chance. She was only 41 when she signed up for your trial. She could have had decades more." Sophia checked her watch. Hours to go before her shift ended. She had planned this confrontation for weeks, since learning Marcus had scheduled a cardiac procedure at Chicago Memorial, never imagining he would arrive unconscious after a massive heart attack. Now, facing his helpless form, some of the righteous anger that had fueled her for years began to feel hollow. What justice would there be in confronting a man who couldn't hear her? What satisfaction in revealing her identity to someone who might never regain consciousness? The revenge she had meticulously planned to reveal herself as the daughter of Teresa Jackson, participant number 37 in the WP-137 trial, to see recognition and perhaps fear in his eyes, now seemed impossible. Yet as the night wore on, and Sophia continued her duties, checking vitals, adjusting medications, and turning Marcus to prevent bedsores, a new plan began to form. Richard's words about the files, about people who could testify, had confirmed what she had long suspected, but could never prove. If evidence of the Newark trials still existed, perhaps justice was still possible, not through personal confrontation, but through finally exposing the truth. As dawn approached, Sophia was updating Marcus's chart when the monitors suddenly began to alarm. His heart rate, stable for days, was becoming erratic. Sophia immediately pressed the emergency call button and began assessment procedures. But even as the room filled with the emergency response team, she knew what was happening. Marcus Wells was going into cardiac arrest. "Beginning CPR," she announced, initiating chest compressions as the crash cart arrived. Dr. Patel, the attending cardiologist, took charge of the resuscitation effort, calling for medications and defibrillation. "Charged to 200. Clear," Dr. Patel called. Sophia stepped back as the electrical current surged through Marcus's body, causing it to jerk upward. The monitor showed no conversion to normal rhythm. "Charged to 300. Clear." Another shock, another failure to convert. Medications were pushed through the IV as the team worked with practice coordination. After 20 minutes of resuscitation efforts, Dr. Patel was about to call for another round when the most unexpected thing happened. Marcus Wells opened his eyes. It wasn't the gradual awakening that sometimes occurred with coma patients. It was sudden. his eyes flying open with an awareness that startled everyone in the room. His gaze darted around, taking in the medical team, the equipment, the urgent activity, before settling on Sophia, who had moved to adjust his medication. Their eyes locked, and for a moment Sophia thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his expression. Not recognition of her as a nurse, or even as a person he might have met before, but a deeper understanding, as if in that moment between life and death, Marcus Wells could see through the professional exterior to the wounded 16-year-old girl whose world he had shattered. His lips moved, forming words that were muffled by the oxygen mask. Sophia leaned closer, telling herself it was her professional duty to hear a patient trying to communicate, not a personal need to hear whatever this man might say in what could be his final moments. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the equipment alarms. Sophia froze, the simple request hitting her with unexpected force. In her imagined confrontation, she had anticipated denial, perhaps even remorse, but never this direct plea for absolution. Before she could respond, the monitors began to wail with new urgency as Marcus's heart rhythm deteriorated further. "V-fib! Charging to 360!" Dr. Patel called out. As the defibrillator charged, Sophia found herself leaning down, her lips close to Marcus's ear. In that suspended moment, with his life literally hanging in the balance, she whispered the truth that had defined her existence for 20 years. "Too late," she said, her eyes moving to the heart monitor as the line went flat. "Some things can't be forgiven." "Clear," Dr. Patel called, and Sophia stepped back, watching dispassionately as another shock failed to restart Marcus Wells's heart. After 45 minutes of resuscitation efforts, Dr. Patel finally called it. "Time of death, 5:43 a.m., he announced solemnly. As the team began to withdraw, Sophia methodically performed her post-mortem duties, disconnecting equipment and preparing the body. Her hands moved automatically while her mind reeled from the unexpected turn of events. She had come face to face with Marcus Wells and spoken her truth, yet she felt no triumph, no sense of closure. Instead, there was a hollowness, a realization that his death changed nothing about the past and did little to secure justice for the future. Within an hour, Richard Wells returned, having been notified of his father's death. He stood beside the bed, staring down at his father's body with an unreadable expression. He regained consciousness briefly before the end, Sophia informed him professionally. Sometimes that happens with coma patients, a moment of lucidity before death. Richard looked up sharply. Did he say anything? Sophia hesitated, considering whether to share Marcus's final words. "He asked for forgiveness," she said finally. Richard's expression hardened. "Forgiveness," he repeated flatly. "I suppose we all seek that in the end." He straightened his tie, visibly pulling himself together. "I'll need to inform the board and prepare a statement. There will be significant changes now." As Richard turned to leave, Sophia spoke again. "Mr. Wells, about those files your father kept, the ones about Newark." Richard stopped, his back to her, tension visible in his shoulders. "You overheard my conversation?" "Yes," Sophia admitted. "I did." Richard turned slowly, studying her with new intensity. "What exactly do you know about Newark, Miss Jackson?" Sophia met his gaze directly. "I know that 20 years ago, Wells Pharmaceuticals conducted clinical trials there for compound WP-137. I know that several participants died due to liver toxicity that your company had evidence of but chose to ignore. I know because my mother was participant number 37. The color drained from Richard's face. You're Teresa Jackson's daughter." The confirmation sent a jolt through Sophia. For years, she had tried to access records to prove what had happened, only to be blocked at every turn by corporate lawyers and sealed documents. Now Richard's recognition was validation of everything she had been fighting to establish. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." Richard seemed to struggle with himself before speaking again. "Ms. Jackson, whatever you think you know about what happened in Newark, "I know enough," Sophia interrupted, "and now I know that evidence still exists. Your father kept files. Those files are private corporate property," Richard said, his voice hardening. "And you've just admitted to eavesdropping on a confidential conversation, which I'm sure violates hospital policy at minimum. Are you threatening me, Mr. Wells?" "I'm reminding you of professional boundaries," Richard replied coolly. "My father is dead. Whatever mistakes he may have made died with him. Wells Pharmaceuticals employs thousands of people and produces medications that save millions of lives. Would you jeopardize all that for a 20-year-old grievance? Is that what you call the deliberate cover-up of fatal side effects? A grievance?" Sophia's professional demeanor finally cracked, her voice rising with indignation. "People died, Mr. Wells. My mother died. And your company buried the evidence and silenced the families with settlements and NDAs. Richard glanced toward the door, clearly concerned about who might overhear. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion," he said in a low voice. "You've done your job caring for my father, and I appreciate that. But I strongly suggest you let the past remain in the past, for everyone's sake." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Sophia alone with the body of Marcus Wells and the realization that the battle for justice she had imagined for so long was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The following week was a blur of media coverage as news of Marcus Wells's death dominated headlines across the country. Business channels debated the future of Wells Pharmaceuticals without its visionary founder, while major newspapers published glowing obituaries that painted Marcus as a brilliant entrepreneur whose medications had revolutionized cancer treatment. A few mentioned controversies over drug pricing, but none touched on the darker aspects of how those drugs had been developed. Sophia watched it all from the periphery, continuing her shifts at Chicago Memorial while secretly gathering every piece of information she could find about the Newark trials. Her mother's meager paperwork, preserved for 2 decades, provided few concrete details, mostly appointment dates, consent forms with vague descriptions of the trial, and finally, the settlement agreement with its strict confidentiality clause. But Richard's unwitting confirmation that his father had kept files gave Sophia new hope. If those files contained what she suspected, internal reports acknowledging the liver toxicity, communications deciding to proceed despite the risks, documentation of deaths being classified as unrelated complications, then the truth could finally come to light. 10 days after Marcus's death, Sophia was leaving her shift when she noticed a black SUV parked across from the hospital's staff exit. As she walked toward the parking garage, the vehicle pulled forward, keeping pace with her. Her heart rate quickened, and she reached for her phone, ready to call security, when the rear window rolled down. "Miss Jackson," called a familiar voice. "A moment, please." Richard Wells leaned forward, visible in the interior light of the vehicle. Sophia hesitated, then approached cautiously, stopping a few feet from the SUV. "Get in," Richard said. "We need to talk." "I'm not getting into your car, Mr. Wells," Richard sighed. "I'm not trying to abduct you, Miss Jackson, but this conversation shouldn't happen on a public street." "Then suggest an alternative," Sophia replied firmly. After a moment's consideration, Richard nodded. "There's a coffee shop around the corner, neutral territory, public place. Acceptable?" 15 minutes later, they sat in a corner booth of an almost empty cafe, steaming cups of coffee between them. Richard had removed his tie, and up close, Sophia could see the toll the past weeks had taken on him, new lines around his eyes, a certain hollowness to his cheeks. "I've spent the past 10 days going through my father's private files," Richard began without preamble, "including the Newark documents." Sophia's hand tightened around her coffee cup. And you were right," Richard admitted, his voice low, "about everything. The toxicity reports were there, along with memos discussing the acceptable risk threshold given the potential market for the drug. There were detailed records of each adverse event, including your mother's death, with strategies for containing liability. Despite having suspected this for years, hearing it confirmed sent a wave of nausea through Sophia. "He knew," she whispered. "He always knew." "Yes," Richard confirmed, "but he wasn't alone. The entire executive team was aware. The board signed off on the final decision to proceed despite the early warning signs. And when participants started dying, they orchestrated the cover-up collectively." "Why are you telling me this?" Sophia asked, studying his face for clues to his motivation. "Aren't you afraid I'll go public?" Richard took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "My father built Wells Pharmaceuticals from nothing. It was his life's work, his legacy. In his mind, the lives lost in Newark were a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, the millions of cancer patients who would later benefit from the refined version of the drug." "That wasn't his choice to make," Sophia said sharply. "Those people didn't volunteer to die for the greater good. They were desperately ill people who trusted your company to help them." "I know," Richard said, surprising her with his agreement. "That's why I've spent the past week making some difficult decisions." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive, placing it on the table between them. "This contains copies of all the Newark files. Everything. The original toxicity reports, the executive decisions, the cover-up strategy, the list of all participants and their outcomes, and the settlements." Sophia stared at the small device, hardly daring to believe it could contain everything she had sought for so long. "Why would you give this to me?" "Because my father's last words were, 'Forgive me,'" Richard said quietly, "and yours were, 'Too late.' I've been thinking about that exchange since you told me about it. My father rarely asked for forgiveness for anything in his life. The fact that it was his final request, it matters. So this is about honoring your father's deathbed remorse?" Sophia asked skeptically. "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "It's about doing what he never could, acknowledging that some wrongs can't simply be buried or paid off. It's about facing the truth, however painful." He pushed the USB drive closer to her. "I'm not giving this to you out of guilt or sentimentality. I'm giving it to you because it's yours. It's your mother's story and the story of everyone else who was sacrificed for my family's success." Sophia hesitated, then picked up the USB drive, turning it over in her fingers. "What happens when I make this public?" "The company will deny everything at first," Richard said matter-of-factly. "The legal team will try to discredit you, claim the documents are forgeries. There will be internal investigations, possibly criminal charges against some former executives who were directly involved. The stock will plummet. There may be layoffs." "And you?" Sophia asked. "You're the CFO. Surely you'll be implicated." "I was 22 when the Newark trials happened, just finishing business school," Richard replied. "But I've benefited from the company's success my entire adult life. I won't escape unscathed, nor should I." He leaned forward. "What matters is that the truth comes out and that the families affected get justice. Real justice, not just confidential settlements." Sophia slipped the USB drive into her purse, still uncertain whether to trust Richard's apparent change of heart. "What changed? When we spoke after your father died, you warned me to leave the past alone." Richard was silent for a long moment. "After our conversation, I went to the safe and read every document, start to finish. I saw your mother's file, with her photo paper-clipped to the medical reports. She looked like you." He met Sophia's eyes. "But it was more than that. It was realizing that my father died seeking forgiveness he never had the courage to ask for in life. It was understanding that the company's success, my family's wealth, was built on a foundation of buried bodies." He drained the last of his coffee and stood up. "Do what you need to do with those files, Ms. Jackson. I won't stand in your way." He placed a business card on the table. "My personal number is on the back. When you decide how to proceed, I'd appreciate a courtesy call. Not to try to stop you, just to be prepared." As Richard walked away, Sophia remained at the table, the weight of the USB drive in her purse feeling suddenly enormous. For 20 years, she had dreamed of exposing the truth about her mother's death. Now that the means to do so were literally in her hands, she faced a new set of questions. Would revealing the truth bring her the peace she had sought for so long? Would it help the other families who had lost loved ones in Newark? And what of the thousands of employees at Wells Pharmaceuticals who had nothing to do with events that occurred 2 decades ago? The answers weren't simple, but as Sophia finally left the cafe and walked into the cool night air, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the lightening of a burden carried too long. Whatever she decided to do with the files, the truth was no longer buried, and that, at least, was a beginning. 3 days later, Sophia sat in her small apartment, surrounded by printouts of the files Richard had given her. She had spent every free hour combing through the documents, absorbing the clinical coldness with which her mother's life and the lives of others had been weighed against profit margins and market projections. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, exactly what she had sought for years. Her phone lay beside her, Richard's card propped against it. She had drafted and discarded a dozen plans for how to proceed. Going to the media was the most direct approach, but which outlet? Would a mainstream newspaper have the resources and will to challenge a pharmaceutical giant? Should she take the evidence to regulators instead, or perhaps find an advocacy group focused on pharmaceutical accountability? As she deliberated, her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Cautiously she answered, "Ms. Jackson, this is Elaine Connors. We haven't met, but I believe we have a connection through Wells Pharmaceuticals." Sophia's grip tightened on the phone. "Who are you?" "My husband was James Connors, participant number 22 in the Newark trials," the woman replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "Richard Wells contacted me yesterday. He said you have the files." By the end of the week, Sophia had spoken with representatives of 11 families who had lost loved ones in the Newark trials. Each conversation was difficult, reopening old wounds while simultaneously validating years of suspicion and frustrated attempts at getting answers. Some, like Sophia, had been young when they lost a parent. Others had lost spouses or siblings. All had been silenced by settlements and legal threats. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance. The Newark 11, they called themselves. With the evidence from Marcus Wells's files, they approached Valerie Chen, a renowned attorney known for taking on corporate giants. Chen reviewed the documents and agreed to represent them immediately. "This isn't just a wrongful death case," Chen explained during their first group meeting in her downtown Chicago office. "This is about corporate malfeasance, fraud, and a cover-up that spans 2 decades. The statute of limitations on some aspects may have expired, but the deliberate concealment of evidence creates new legal avenues." "What exactly are we seeking?" asked Michael Durbin, who had lost his father in the trials. "More money? Because I don't want their blood money." "Justice takes many forms," Chen replied. "Financial compensation is one aspect, yes, but there's also regulatory accountability, public disclosure, and structural change. Based on these documents, Wells Pharmaceuticals should face criminal charges, significant fines, and mandatory oversight going forward." "Will this bankrupt the company?" asked another family member nervously. "My son works in their research division now. Ironically enough, he had nothing to do with Newark." "Our target isn't to destroy Wells Pharmaceuticals," Sophia interjected. "It's to hold accountable those who made these decisions and covered them up. The company can survive this if it acknowledges the wrong and makes genuine amends." As the meeting continued, Sophia stepped out briefly to make a call. Richard answered immediately. "It's happening," she told him without preamble. "We've engaged Valerie Chen. She'll be filing initial papers next week, but there will be a press conference tomorrow morning. I thought you should know." There was a pause on the line. "Thank you for the courtesy," Richard replied. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." "You could join us," Sophia suggested, surprising herself with the offer. "Stand with the families. Show that Wells Pharmaceuticals under your leadership is different from what it was under your father's. I appreciate the suggestion, but my presence would only complicate things at this stage, Richard said. The focus should be on the victims and their stories. But I promise you this. When Chen files those papers, Wells Pharmaceuticals won't fight them. We'll acknowledge what happened, cooperate fully with any investigation, and work to make proper restitution. The press conference the next morning made national news. 11 families stood united behind Valerie Chen as she outlined the case against Wells Pharmaceuticals, presenting key documents that proved the company had known about the fatal liver toxicity of compound WP-137, yet proceeded with human trials anyway. Sophia, as the youngest victim at the time of the trials, and now a healthcare professional herself, became the natural spokesperson for the group. My mother believed she was participating in something that might help others, even if it didn't save her own life, Sophia told the gathered reporters, her voice steady despite the cameras and microphones pointed at her. Instead, she and 16 others became casualties in the pursuit of profit. Today, we finally break the silence that has surrounded their deaths for 20 years. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Wells Pharmaceuticals stock plunged 30% by market close. Medical ethics experts flooded news programs debating the implications of the case. Social media erupted with calls for boycotts, regulation, and criminal charges against those responsible. Richard Wells, true to his word, issued a statement that afternoon acknowledging the allegations and announcing an independent investigation. Wells Pharmaceuticals will not contest these claims, the statement read. We acknowledge, with profound regret, the events that occurred in Newark 20 years ago and are committed to providing full transparency and appropriate restitution to the affected families. In the following months, the case expanded beyond civil litigation. Federal prosecutors opened a criminal investigation into the executives involved in the cover-up. The FDA launched a comprehensive review of all Wells Pharmaceuticals products and approval processes. 3 former executives were indicted on charges ranging from fraud to negligent homicide. Throughout it all, Sophia continued her work at Chicago Memorial, finding unexpected strength in the daily routine of patient care, even as her face became recognizable from news coverage. Some colleagues kept their distance, uncomfortable with her role in the case against a major pharmaceutical company. Others expressed quiet support. 4 months after the press conference, as the case moved through preliminary court procedures, Sophia received another unexpected call from Richard Wells. I'm stepping down as CFO, he told her without preamble. The board is announcing a complete leadership overhaul tomorrow. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. Are you being forced out? Sophia asked. Not exactly. It's a mutual decision. The company needs new leadership untainted by the past to move forward. I've recommended a structure that includes an ethics oversight board with seats for patient advocates and independent medical experts. There was a pause before he continued. I've also proposed that 1 seat be reserved for a representative of the Newark 11, if you're interested. Sophia was momentarily speechless. You want me to serve on the board of Wells Pharmaceuticals? I want someone who will never allow what happened to your mother to happen again, Richard replied. Someone who understands both the human cost of corporate negligence and the legitimate value of developing life-saving medications. You're uniquely qualified, Ms. Jackson. The idea was so unexpected that Sophia couldn't immediately respond. The thought of working with the company that had caused her mother's death seemed impossible. Yet the opportunity to ensure ethical practices from within was compelling. I need time to think about it, she said finally, and to discuss it with the other families. Of course, Richard agreed. The offer remains open, regardless of the outcome of the legal proceedings. This isn't about public relations or settling the case. It's about fundamentally changing how the company operates going forward. After they hung up, Sophia sat for a long time, considering the unexpected turn of events. From the night she had whispered too late to a dying Marcus Wells to this moment, the path had been neither straight nor simple. Justice, she was learning, rarely came in the form one expected, and healing seldom followed the timeline one hoped for. Yet something had shifted, not just in the public exposure of what had happened in Newark or in the pending legal consequences, but in Sophia herself. The burning need for vengeance that had driven her for 2 decades had been replaced by something more nuanced, a commitment to ensuring that her mother's death and the deaths of 16 others led to meaningful change. As spring turned to summer and the legal proceedings continued, Sophia found herself increasingly involved in discussions about the future of Wells Pharmaceuticals. The company, under interim leadership, was undergoing a complete transformation. New ethics protocols, transparent clinical trial practices, and a commitment to affordable pricing. The Newark settlement, when it finally came, included not just substantial financial compensation, but also funding for an independent watchdog organization to monitor pharmaceutical trials nationwide. On the anniversary of her mother's death, Sophia visited the small cemetery where Teresa Jackson was buried. She placed fresh flowers beside the modest headstone and sat on the bench nearby, the summer breeze rustling the leaves overhead. "It's done, Mom," she said softly. "Not the way I imagined, but it's done. People know the truth now. No one can bury it again." She touched the locket around her neck, containing her mother's photo. "You deserved better than what happened to you. All of you did, but something good is finally coming from it." As she sat in peaceful reflection, her phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. "Board approved the Ethics Oversight Committee structure today. Your seat awaits you, if you want it." Sophia looked from the message to her mother's grave and back again. The journey from that hospital room, where she had whispered too late to a dying man, to this moment of potential transformation, had been unexpected and complex. Forgiveness, she had learned, wasn't a simple yes or no proposition. It was a process, one that sometimes involved ensuring accountability before healing could begin. She typed her reply, "I'll do it. Not for Wells Pharmaceuticals, for my mother and the 16 others. Their names should be on the boardroom wall." Richard's response came quickly. "They will be. You have my word." As Sophia left the cemetery, she felt a sense of closure that had eluded her for 20 years. Marcus Wells had asked for forgiveness in his final moments, and she had denied it, believing it was too late. Perhaps she had been both right and wrong. Too late for him, perhaps, but not too late for the truth to emerge, for justice to take its course, or for healing to begin. Some wounds might never fully heal, and some actions could never be truly forgiven. But in the space between justice and mercy, between accountability and redemption, Sophia had found something she hadn't expected, a way forward that honored the past while refusing to be defined by it. 1 year after the Newark 11 case first made headlines, Sophia Jackson walked through the gleaming lobby of the Wells Pharmaceuticals headquarters in downtown Chicago. The security guard recognized her immediately, not just as a member of the newly established Ethics Oversight Board, but as the face of a case that had fundamentally transformed the company and sent ripples through the entire pharmaceutical industry. "Good morning, Ms. Jackson," he greeted her, processing her visitor badge. "The board is already gathering in conference room A." Sophia nodded her thanks and made her way to the elevator. She had taken a leave of absence from Chicago Memorial 6 months ago to focus on her role with the Oversight Board, though she still worked occasional shifts to maintain her nursing credentials. The transition hadn't been easy, from caregiver to corporate watchdog, from seeking justice to helping build a new accountability framework. But she had discovered an unexpected aptitude for the work. As the elevator ascended to the executive floor, Sophia reflected on the whirlwind of the past year. The Newark case had resulted in a $1.2 billion settlement for the families, criminal charges against 3 former executives, and a complete overhaul of Wells Pharmaceuticals' leadership and practices. The company's stock had initially plummeted but had gradually recovered as investors responded positively to the transparency and ethical reforms implemented under the new management. Richard Wells had kept his word, stepping down as CFO and recommending an experienced pharmaceutical executive with a background in medical ethics to take over as CEO. He had also established the Teresa Jackson Foundation, funded with his personal fortune rather than company money, to support greater diversity in clinical trials and ensure participant safety. The elevator doors opened onto a floor that had been completely redesigned since Sophia's first visit. Gone were the imposing dark wood and intimidating corporate aesthetic. The new space featured glass walls, collaborative workspaces, and, most meaningfully to Sophia, a memorial wall bearing the names and photographs of all 17 participants who had died during the Newark trials. Each morning, employees and visitors passed by these faces, a permanent reminder of the human cost of ethical failures. Sophia paused at the wall, as she always did, to touch her mother's photograph briefly before continuing to the conference room. Inside, the Ethics Oversight Board was assembling, a diverse group of medical professionals, patient advocates, ethicists, and regulatory experts. Among them, representing the Wells family's continuing connection to the company, was Richard, now serving as a non-executive board member. He nodded to Sophia as she entered, their relationship having evolved into a complex but respectful collaboration. They would never be friends. The shadow of Newark and Marcus Wells's actions was too long for that, but they had found common ground in their commitment to reform. "Before we begin," announced Dr. Mei Chen, the chair of the committee, "I want to acknowledge a significant milestone. Today marks 1 year since the public disclosure of the Newark trials, and it seems appropriate to take a moment to reflect on how far we've come and how much work remains ahead." A solemn nod passed through the room. Everyone present understood the gravity of what had occurred and the responsibility they now carried. "Sophia," Dr. Chen continued, "would you like to say a few words? It seems fitting." Sophia hadn't prepared anything, but as all eyes turned to her, she found the words coming naturally. "A year ago, I believed justice meant exposing wrongdoing and holding individuals accountable. That's still true, but I've learned that real justice also involves transformation, turning past failures into better systems, greater accountability, and a commitment to never repeating the same mistakes." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person present. "The 17 people who died in Newark can never be brought back. Their families, including my own, live with that loss every day. But what we're building here, a framework that prioritizes human lives over profit margins, transparency over secrecy, ethics over expediency, that's a form of justice too. It doesn't erase the past, but it helps ensure a better future." Dr. Chen thanked her, and the meeting proceeded with its agenda, reviewing new clinical trial protocols, examining reporting mechanisms for adverse events, and discussing an initiative to make the company's breakthrough cancer treatments more affordable in developing nations. Sophia participated actively, bringing both her healthcare perspective and her personal connection to the Newark tragedy to the discussions. After the meeting, as the board members dispersed, Richard approached Sophia. "There's something I'd like to show you, if you have a few minutes." Curious, Sophia followed him down the corridor to a part of the executive floor she hadn't visited before. They stopped outside a door marked simply Archives. "We've been digitizing all company records as part of our transparency initiative," Richard explained, using his badge to unlock the door. "Last week, the team came across something I think belongs to you." Inside, a climate-controlled room housed the company's historical documents. A white-gloved archivist approached with a small, carefully preserved cardboard box. "We found this in a storage facility in New Jersey," the archivist explained, gently opening the box to reveal its contents. It was with the original Newark trial documents. Inside was a simple silver bracelet with a heart-shaped charm. Sophia gasped softly, recognizing it immediately. "That's my mother's," she whispered, carefully taking the bracelet from the box. "She was wearing it when she went into the hospital for the final time. I thought it had been lost." The charm still bore the faded engraving. "To Teresa, all my love, James." A gift from Sophia's father, who had died when she was just 8 years old. "It must have been removed during medical procedures and somehow ended up with her file," Richard suggested. "It should have been returned to your family." Sophia cradled the bracelet in her palm, this unexpected, tangible connection to her mother, bringing a rush of emotions. "Thank you for finding this," she said quietly. Richard nodded, understanding the significance of the moment. "There's something else," he said, hesitating slightly. "Something I've been considering discussing with you for some time." They moved to a small seating area in the corner of the archives room, away from the archivist who had discreetly returned to her work. "When my father died," Richard began, "he left a personal journal in the same safe where he kept the Newark files. I've never shown it to anyone, not even the investigators or attorneys involved in the case. It wasn't relevant to the legal proceedings, but it might be relevant to you personally." He removed a small, leather-bound book from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table between them. The last few entries deal with his knowledge that he was facing significant cardiac issues and his reflections on his life and career. There are several pages specifically about Newark. Sophia stared at the journal, uncertain whether she wanted to read Marcus Wells's private thoughts. What possible comfort or closure could his words provide now? "I don't need to see his justifications," she said stiffly. "It's not justification," Richard replied. "It's accountability, too late and too private perhaps, but real nonetheless. He knew he was wrong, Sophia. He knew what he'd done to your mother and the others." After a moment's hesitation, Sophia reached for the journal, opening it to the bookmarked page. Marcus's handwriting was neat and precise, the words of a man accustomed to authority. "May 12th. Another warning from Dr. Levinson today about my heart. He doesn't know I've already seen the scans. Significant blockage in 3 arteries. He's recommending immediate surgery. I've scheduled it for next week at Chicago Memorial, but I'm under no illusions. At 68, with my family history, the odds aren't favorable. I find myself thinking about Newark more and more as I face my own mortality. Those 17 faces haunt me now. We told ourselves it was for the greater good, that the perfected drug would save millions, justifying the loss of a few. Teresa Jackson, James Durbin, Elaine Foster. I know all their names, though I've pretended to forget. Their faces appear in my dreams, not accusing, just present, witnesses to what we did. The drug has indeed saved millions. Our shareholders have prospered. The company has grown beyond anything I imagined when I started it in my garage 30 years ago. By every conventional measure, Wells Pharmaceuticals is a tremendous success story. Yet I know now what I refused to acknowledge then. We broke faith with those who trusted us most completely, the desperately ill who looked to us for help, for hope. We betrayed that trust for expediency, for profit margins, for market share. Richard found the Newark files last month. I saw it in his eyes when he came to my office afterward. The shock, the disgust, the realization of what his inheritance is built upon. He didn't confront me directly. Perhaps he's waiting for me to broach the subject, to offer some explanation that would make sense of such a profound moral failure. But what could I possibly say to justify the unjustifiable? If I survive this surgery, perhaps I'll find the courage to face what I've done, to make public acknowledgement, to offer what restitution I can, though it will never be enough. If I don't survive, God help me. I've carried this secret too long already. The entry ended there. Sophia turned the page to find a final brief note written in a shakier hand. May 15th, chest pains began at 2 a.m., calling for ambulance. If these are my final hours, let it be recorded that I, Marcus Daniel Wells, acknowledge my responsibility for the deaths in Newark and the subsequent cover-up. May those I've wronged find it in their hearts to forgive what I, myself, cannot forgive. Sophia closed the journal, her emotions conflicted. Marcus's private acknowledgement of wrongdoing, while meaningful in some abstract sense, had come far too late to help any of the victims or their families. Yet there was something powerful in seeing his handwritten confession, in knowing that despite his public denials, he had privately recognized the moral bankruptcy of his actions. "Why show me this now?" she asked Richard, sliding the journal back across the table. "Because I wanted you to know that your confrontation with him in that hospital room mattered," Richard replied. "When you said, 'too late,' you were right. It was too late for him to make amends directly. But that moment, and whatever he saw in your eyes then, seems to have been the catalyst for his final reckoning with what he'd done." Sophia fastened her mother's bracelet around her wrist, its familiar weight both comforting and painful. "Does knowing he regretted it change anything? Does it bring any of them back?" "No," Richard acknowledged. "It doesn't. Nothing can do that. But I think there's value in knowing that even someone like my father, who spent decades justifying his actions, building elaborate moral frameworks to support unconscionable decisions, could eventually recognize the fundamental wrongness of what he'd done." As they left the archives, Sophia found herself reflecting on the nature of justice and forgiveness. The Newark case had brought public accountability, financial restitution, and structural changes to prevent similar tragedies, all vital aspects of justice. Marcus's private regret, recorded in a journal no one was meant to see until after his death, was something else entirely, a personal reckoning that had come too late to matter to anyone but himself. Yet as she touched her mother's bracelet now back where it belonged, Sophia realized that the journey that had begun with those whispered words in a hospital room, "Forgive me," and "too late," had led to outcomes no one could have predicted. Not just the exposure of the Newark trials or the transformation of Wells Pharmaceuticals, but this moment of truth between the son of the man responsible and the daughter of one of his victims. "The memorial wall," Sophia said suddenly as they walked back toward the elevator. "It was your idea, wasn't it? Not a corporate decision or a PR strategy." Richard nodded. "After reading my father's journal, I knew the names and faces of those who died needed to be present, visible, not hidden away in files or reduced to case numbers. Everyone who works here, everyone who visits, needs to see the human cost of ethical failures." "It matters," Sophia said quietly. "Acknowledgement matters." As she left Wells Pharmaceuticals that afternoon, Sophia's mind returned to her mother, not as she had been in her final days in the hospital, weakened and jaundiced from liver failure, but as she had been before, vibrant, determined, always wearing the silver bracelet that now adorned Sophia's own wrist. Teresa Jackson had enrolled in the Newark trials, not just seeking treatment for herself, but hoping to contribute to research that might help future patients. In the most painful of ironies, her death had ultimately led to exactly that, not through the drug that killed her, but through the reforms her daughter had helped implement 2 decades later. That evening, Sophia met with several members of the Newark 11 for their monthly dinner, a tradition they had established to maintain their bonds beyond the legal proceedings. Michael Durbin, who had lost his father in the trials, raised his glass in a toast. "To transformation," he said. "From victims to advocates, from silenced to heard." Sophia raised her glass, adding quietly, "And to those who couldn't be here. May we continue to honor them through our work." Later that night, alone in her apartment, Sophia took out the box of her mother's possessions that she had preserved all these years. To the collection of photos, letters, and mementos, she now added the silver bracelet, removed for the night but too precious to wear constantly. As she sorted through the items, a folded note fell from between the pages of her mother's Bible, a note Sophia had read countless times over the years. Written from her hospital bed in the final days of the Newark trial, Teresa had somehow found the strength to leave this message for her 16-year-old daughter. My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this, then things have not gone as we hoped. I'm so sorry to leave you, especially like this. Know that I fought as hard as I could to stay with you. Remember 3 things, my brave girl. First, this was my choice. I entered this trial with open eyes, knowing the risks, hoping for healing but prepared for all outcomes. Second, whatever happens, do not let anger consume you. Seek truth, seek justice if wrongs were done, but never let bitterness take root in your beautiful heart. Third, and most important, find your path to serve others. In serving, we find purpose beyond ourselves. Your compassion has always been your greatest strength. Let it guide you. I love you beyond words, beyond time, beyond this failing body. I am so proud of the woman you are becoming. Live fully, love deeply, and when you remember me, remember the joy we shared. Not these final difficult days. All my love eternally. Mom Sophia traced her mother's handwriting with her fingertip, these familiar words taking on new resonance after the day's revelations. Seek truth, seek justice if wrongs were done, but never let bitterness take root in your beautiful heart. Had she honored that request? The truth had finally emerged. Justice was being served in various forms, but what of bitterness? Sophia had carried her anger for so long it had become part of her identity, the wronged daughter seeking vindication. Only in the past year, as justice took unexpected forms, had she begun to feel that grip loosening. She thought of Marcus Wells's journal, his private recognition of guilt too late to make amends to those he had harmed. She thought of Richard, working to transform his father's company into something that might eventually deserve trust again. And she thought of her own journey, from that whispered too late to her current role helping rebuild systems to protect future patients. Some wounds never fully heal. Some actions can never be truly forgiven. Yet Sophia had found something she hadn't anticipated, a purpose beyond her personal quest for justice, a way to honor her mother's memory by creating change that would protect others. As she replaced her mother's note in the Bible and closed the box of mementos, Sophia felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for 2 decades. Teresa Jackson had asked her daughter not to let bitterness take root, and though the path had been longer and more complex than either could have imagined, Sophia had finally found her way to that higher ground, not through forgetting or forgiving the unforgivable, but through transforming tragedy into purpose, pain into protection for others. "It's not too late for this, Mom," she whispered to the quiet room. "It's not too late for this." The following morning, Sophia returned to the Ethics Oversight Board with a proposal she had been developing for months, but had hesitated to present. A comprehensive patient advocacy program that would give participants in clinical trials direct access to independent medical advisors, ensuring they received complete information about risks and alternatives. "We'll call it the Teresa Jackson Protocol," she explained to the board. "It establishes a layer of protection between vulnerable patients and the financial interests of the company." The board unanimously approved the proposal, and in the following months, the protocol became a model adopted by other pharmaceutical companies under pressure from regulators and advocacy groups. What had begun in one hospital room with a dying CEO's plea for forgiveness and a nurse's whispered, "too late," had rippled outward, creating change far beyond what anyone could have predicted. 2 years after Marcus Wells's death, a memorial garden was dedicated on the site of the former Newark Research Facility, now demolished. 17 cherry trees, one for each life lost, bloomed in the spring, their beauty a reminder of both what had been lost and what had been gained. A simple stone marker bore the names of those who had died, and a quotation suggested by Sophia from her mother's final note: "In seeking truth and serving others, we find purpose beyond ourselves." As Sophia stood beside her mother's tree, watching children from the surrounding neighborhood play nearby, she reflected on the complex journey from anger to advocacy, from seeking personal justice to creating systemic change. Marcus Wells had asked for forgiveness in his final moments, something Sophia had not been able to grant then and still found difficult to contemplate now. Some acts, some decisions, perhaps lay beyond the reach of simple forgiveness. Yet in the ongoing work of reform, in the lives that would be protected by new protocols and oversight, in the transparency that now governed an industry once shrouded in secrecy, there was a different kind of redemption. Not of the man who had made those fateful decisions, but of the system that had allowed them. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. But it was, Sophia had come to believe, what her mother would have wanted: truth acknowledged, justice served, and most importantly, others protected from similar harm. In that sense, though Sophia had whispered "too late" to Marcus Wells as he lay dying, it had not been too late for something meaningful to emerge from the tragedy of Newark. As she touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, now a permanent part of her daily attire, Sophia made a silent promise to her mother and to the 16 others memorialized in this garden. The truth would remain known, the lessons would not be forgotten, and their deaths, though never justified, would continue to fuel change that would protect countless others in the years to come. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was perhaps something equally powerful: a transformation of grief into purpose, of loss into legacy, of too late into never again. If this story taught you something valuable about the complexities of justice, forgiveness, and institutional change, please share it with others who might benefit from its message. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us next week for another true story about the unexpected ways our actions can ripple through lives, including our own. Thank you for watching.